Welcome. My name is Sarah Clute-Bain. I am the Boone County Hospital Foundation Director. And for those of you who may not be familiar with our program, Educating and Empowering You, we call it EEU for short. We have been doing this program, gosh, I think for almost a decade now, which is incredible. But around the time of the pandemic, we went to online. So we have the opportunity to connect with people everywhere, which is really great. Maybe one of the benefits, small benefits from the pandemic, is knowing that we can all be connected here. So this will be recorded. This will be sent out on our website and on social media for viewing afterwards. We also have it available on SoundCloud, so it will be available for just audio if you want to listen to it or send it to somebody that could listen to it, for example, like a podcast in their car. So just really grateful to have Brandy here this month. Next month, we're going to have Senior Life Solutions presenting. That's Heidi Kennedy. They're just getting started this week at Boone County Hospital with some mental health services for seniors. So we'll have that next month. And I think we have a pretty full calendar this year. So I'm really, really grateful to have Brandy here again. As I was saying, I just think that this is something that's so important for us to understand more about and know more. And I think that the other thing too is that we don't maybe necessarily, or we have kind of like a vision in our mind. I'm sure you're going to talk all about this, Brandy, about, we have a vision in our mind about what sex trafficking is or what it looks like. And, from my standpoint, I think that it's just a great way for us to get this information out to the community through our program here at Boone County Hospital and EEU. So Brandy, you are the executive director of Wings of Refuge, and you are located in Ames, correct?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm just going to turn it over to you. Apologize, my phone's ringing in the background here, but I'm going to turn it over to you to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit more and get started with our program.
Thank you so much for having me. As Sarah said, my name is Brandy Young, and I'm the executive director of Wings of Refuge. And so I just thought I'd start by giving an overview of what we're going to hopefully cover today. I thought I would start with an overview of trafficking, and then provide an overview of Wings of Refuge, what the response is to that. I'll take some time to share some myths, some indicators, some helpful questions that can help to ask survivors just to help with the identification, and then share some resources at the end, such as the hotline and things of that, and give some time for questions. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So Wings of Refuge is a Christ-centered organization that provides opportunities for healing and restoration to survivors of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. We do that by providing a long-term restorative safe home, meaningful work through a social enterprise, as well as a second home that we're now able to offer, which is a transitional living center as the women transition to living in independence. Our mission is so exploitation ends for one more girl. This has been our mission since the organization was founded. We were founded 10 years ago this year. And the reason why I point this out is for that, for ends for one more girl. As I'll share here some of the statistics of trafficking, the issue is much bigger and much closer than what we often think about. And sometimes when we start realizing the magnitude of the problem, it can feel overwhelming. And what can we do that truly makes a difference? And that's, for us, the importance of coming down to that one more girl. For us, it is the next woman that is walking through the door. It's the one that's right before us. And so it keeps us focused on what's important in the moment and helping the women in our program. You will hear me say the women, or in this case, the for one more girl, because we do provide, Wings of Refuge provides long-term housing specifically to adult female survivors of sex trafficking. So I wanted to share initially, just do some ground leveling of what is sex trafficking. When I say that, what am I talking about? So I'm sure that you've heard a common word or phrase that we hear is human trafficking. Human trafficking is, sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking, but it can also include labor trafficking too. Those that are forced to work for unfair or no wage. Specifically, Wings of Refuge serves survivors of sex trafficking. So what is it? It's a form of modern day slavery in which individuals are forced to perform commercial sex acts for the profit of others through force, fraud, or coercion. And I want to camp on a moment with that force, fraud, or coercion, because that's often where we start to broaden our understanding of what is really included in sex trafficking and how people get into it. Often people look at just that. Let's look for a moment at that force category. The kidnapping, the torture, the physical abuse, the confinement. Many times, often because we watched a movie that one time that showed the entrance into trafficking being a kidnapping situation. But statistics we've seen, according to the FBI, is that less than 1% of human trafficking victims were actually taken by someone, by a stranger, someone they didn't know. The majority of cases are actually happening by someone that has formed a relationship with the victim or the survivor. So as we look at fraud or coercion, this is often much more common of what we'll see. Fraud, looking at things like deceit, false promises, fake job, fake relationship. Coercion can include threats of harm, debt bondage, blackmail, psychological manipulation, and substance dependency. And so this is one of the complications of if we only have one image of what trafficking is and it's kidnapping, then we don't realize all of the other ways that people can get into this life more through that fraud and coercion. So I want to just take a moment and look nationally. So sometimes one of the biggest misunderstandings is that trafficking is something that happens over there, overseas. We're scared of our daughter traveling, if she gets kidnapped. But realistically, trafficking has been documented in all 50 states. All 50 states naturally includes Iowa. And I don't say that fact like we should be proud of it. It's just what's happening in the world throughout the US today. We are going to look at a few statistics, but before we do, I just want to share this quote at the top. It says human trafficking is notoriously underreported. Shocking as these numbers are, they are likely only a fraction of the actual problem. Why is that the case? Because the only statistics we can track are the ones that actually called the hotline when the situation was reported. So we can track those statistics, but we know there's many, many other cases happening that never actually get reported. So these numbers that I have here at the bottom, they're the most recent numbers you can pull from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and it's from 2021. Where there was over 10,000 situations of human trafficking reported that year in the US, involving over 16,000 individual victims. Now, again, just pause for a moment. That number might sound really high. That number might sound low compared to what you were thinking. But again, those are only the situations that were actually called and documented. If we narrow in a little closer and look at Iowa, this is where we can actually look at, there was a recent report done by a Safe House program that actually extrapolated some of the statistics to try to get a more accurate number of how many victims we actually think exist in each state. So if you look at the hotline numbers, Iowa typically gets just under 300 calls a year to report a trafficking situation. And so in this report, they looked at that number and realized Iowa receives 9 trafficking reports per 100,000 people. We have about 3 million is the population in Iowa. It's estimated that only 1% of trafficking survivors are identified. So that's only representing 1% of what actually exists. Therefore, it's estimated that 8,600 people in Iowa are victims of trafficking annually. Now, why is that the case? Is because trafficking is much broader than what we typically imagine it is. It does not only include, again, those kidnapping situations. If we just look at Wings of Refuge, which is a ministry here in Iowa serving survivors, half of the survivors that have come to live in our home since we were founded in 2013 come from Iowa. We serve survivors from that are trafficked domestically, so they can come as far as California or either coast, but half of them have actually come from Iowa and the rest from surrounding states or across the US. So I want to shift the question of, instead of asking where does trafficking happen, because trafficking does happen across the US, big cities and small towns, instead I want to ask the question of who does trafficking happen to? And trafficking happens to the vulnerable. Now, we're all vulnerable. We can all be vulnerable because we're human, but certain factors increase our vulnerability. Significant risk factors include recent migration or relocation, substance use, mental health concerns, involvement with a child healthcare, welfare system, being a runaway or homeless youth. And what traffickers do is they identify and leverage their victims' vulnerabilities in order to create dependency. Now, since I've been working in the trafficking space, I find that to be, there's a lot of things that are quite frankly dark and disturbing when you're dealing with trafficking. But this is one of the more disturbing ones. And that's the fact that traffickers target vulnerabilities. They will often come in and meet the needs that they are finding in their potential victim. When I said earlier that most victims actually know their trafficker, it is because traffickers intentionally build relationships and create dependencies. And so if we take one of these factors, like let's take a runaway. What does a runaway typically need? Housing, finances, support. And so a trafficker might come into that situation and meet those needs as a way to create trust and create dependency. Often that process is called grooming, where they form a relationship, build bonds of trust before they kind of flip the switch and then force them into a life of trafficking. And so again, it doesn't mean if you've experienced any of these things, you will be targeted. These are just factors that can increase our vulnerability. And the more vulnerable someone is, the more likely they may fall prey to a trafficker who's meeting their needs. And so that's kind of, we're going to bounce back near the end of the presentation on a few more just educational components on what to look for. But I just wanted to take a break in the middle here and say, so if that's the issue of trafficking, then what do we do about it? And specifically, I'm here to share today about Wings of Refuge and what do we do to combat the evil of domestic sex trafficking. And so we combat that through 4 different ways: reach, recover, restore, and rise. I'm going to go ahead and dive into those. Oops. The first is reach through education and awareness. So we believe that the more that we can help to educate and inform the community of what trafficking is, signs to look for, and specifically how to support survivors, the bigger impact we can make. So it begins with you. It's things like this. It's educational seminars, workshops. We do a couple trainings a year, as well as smaller settings like this, where we're getting to meet with individual groups and people in the community to increase the awareness of trafficking. The second is recover. We network with others who are on the front lines of recovering survivors. So, a question that I will often get is, how do women actually make it to Wings of Refuge? How do they get placed in the program? And this is where networking is critically important. So, networking with people and agencies like law enforcement, the trafficking hotline, social service agencies, homeless shelters, hospitals, mental health advocates, other safe homes. And so all of the places that survivors might be showing up, and someone typically helps identify that, oh, I think this is actually a survivor of trafficking. And if and when she is ready to choose long-term placement to work on her healing and restoration, we are on all of those referral lists. And so we get referrals fairly regularly, both locally and across the US, of women that are looking for long-term placement. If we have bed availability, then we're working through to make sure that that woman would be a good fit in the home. We are a long-term restoration home. We're not an emergency shelter. So when women are choosing to come to Wings, it means they're really looking to dig in to help process their trauma, to go seek counseling and get help. So they're signing up for a long-term program. And we're explaining that through the intake process, again, to help her decide, are we the right fit for her? And is she the right fit for the program? Once she comes to the home, restoration is kind of Wings of Refuge bread and butter. So this is where we focus the majority of our attention, providing that safe home where we provide holistic healing and programming, or a place for holistic healing. And what do I mean by that? As you can imagine, someone that has been in the commercial sex industry has not necessarily had many, if any, of her needs truly looked out for. So she's coming with physical needs, emotional needs. And so we look at her as the whole person. We are not the experts in all of these areas. And so we're networking again with those in the community that can provide services. So hooking each woman up with her appropriate healthcare workers. Each one starts counseling if there's substance abuse, and there often is, because that is one of the controlling techniques that traffickers use, providing them with substance abuse counseling. Sitting down with each woman and understanding her life goals and educational goals. You know, many of the women that come to us, those vulnerability factors that they experienced in their childhood that actually set them up to be trafficked, means they didn't necessarily have stability in their childhood. They weren't necessarily asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And so we're getting to facilitate those questions and help her develop goals to start to work towards. So some want to finish their high school education, some want to go on to higher education. So again, a very individualized approach in order to walk alongside her on her healing journey. So this is another question I often get, and it's, how come a place like Wings is necessary? Because once she's free, can't she go live in freedom? And just to pause here, we say often it can feel like a huge gap between her freedom when she's able to get out of the life and actually living in true freedom when you've healed and processed from that trauma. So something I find interesting is when they did a brain study on the effects of trauma on survivors of trafficking, and a brain study on the effects of trauma from people coming back from war, the effects were similar. And so there's high levels of PTSD and unresolved trauma that is affecting the way or preventing them from living healthy lives. And so that's where at Wings we create this safe environment where she can start to take steps toward her healing. And I always say, we don't do the work, we create the environment. She is the hero of her own story. She has to dig in and, process through things, which can be very difficult. We create the environment for her to be able to do that. And so part of that healing journey, we realize, is workplace readiness and education, where she's able to step back into a healthy working environment. This is often very distorted as she's been forced to use her body as a means of income. And so just helping to reconcile a healthy working environment, we do that through our social enterprise. So we actually hire the women to make handcrafted products and do some job skills training. So it's their first kind of job back is through our social enterprise. So those products include our newest, our earrings. I'm wearing a pair today. They make greeting cards, bracelets, alpaca hats, and candles. So we partner with local small businesses that are, already the experts in making products in many of the cases. And then they design specific things for the women at Wings. And the women at Wings are 100% responsible for these products. And what do I mean by that? When we pour candles, they're picking out the scents, they're doing the pouring, they're labeling. So when we have and advertise our survivor made products, that's why, it's because they are 100% survivor made. Why is this important part of the program? Is I will say the women come alive when they are able to see that they're creating something that the community sees has value. And that's the biggest thing we've seen, is this kind of restored sense of worth and value of, I can create something of meaning for the community. And again, it's part of their job skills training when they're with us. Wings does also offer a savings program as part of that work program. And our hope, our goal is that they're moving toward independence, and that's what we're hoping to set them up for. Part of that journey toward independence includes now a second home. So I explained kind of the first home, that restorative programming, when we're taking a very holistic approach. Once they graduate the program, so they can be in the restoration home, it usually lasts up to a year. Each woman's journey is a little bit unique and different, but it roughly lasts a year. Once she graduates, she has the option of moving to our transitional living center, which is a stepping stone to independence. So her life is less programmed, at that point, but she can still have staff available, support. She can opt into classes. A story that I like to tell because I find it so endearing is, before we had the TLC, a woman graduated and moved into her own apartment. And she reached out to us a couple months later and said, that financial literacy class that, you made me take while I was in your program? She said, yeah, I really should have paid attention, because now that I'm budgeting, I need to implement those skills. Can I come back and take the class? Yes, absolutely. Well, now that we offer the transitional living center, those are the things that they're easily able to opt back into. I want to take another class on this, or I want to retake that class. And we are located right there. We actually have the learning center is in the downstairs of this home. And then the upstairs has 5 micro apartments, shared kitchen, shared living space. It's a beautiful home. I said this home experienced its own transformation. It was gifted to us from another ministry after sustaining a house fire, and had a lot of smoke damage. And in the end, at first we didn't think it was a gift, and then we chose to accept it when a contractor said the bones were good. And just it went under a beautiful renovation, and it became very apparent. I've heard our founder say that when the renovation was happening, it's very similar experience to what the women experience at Wings. When they come to us, they feel damaged, they feel beat up. And then as you're giving them the opportunity to experience that restoration, they start to become who they were created to be. And that was kind of the story of this house, after it had been damaged, and then seeing how beautiful it is today. Ultimately, we are working toward that healthy launch from Wings. So that's always the end goal, is what does healthy independence look like for each woman? Just a little bit of context, this quote at the top, at Wings, I got my life back. No, actually, I got my life for the first time. If we go back and think about some of those vulnerability factors that I shared near the beginning, many of the women experienced, not all, but many experienced very unstable or traumatic childhoods. And so they didn't really have a lot of stability growing up. And so when they come into the home, and it's the first time that birthdays are getting celebrated or they're doing meals together, things like that, it's the first time they're experiencing those rhythms. And so that's kind of the heart behind this is, no, actually, I got my life for the first time. And I just wanted to share this to kind of brag on our community. Many times when I share, kind of the reality of trafficking, one of the first questions we get is, what can I do about the issue of trafficking? And we love to kick that back and say, well, what do you already do? What are you good at? Can you do that in a way that supports survivors in the community? And so these are 3 examples. We had people that love to golf, and they planned golf outings. They're actually bringing it back this summer as a fundraiser for Wings, a way to support survivors. We had Susan and Roger Parker there on the left, that they chose to do an archery event, a 3D archery as a fundraiser for Wings. That'll be the 3rd annual. And then we have these 2 little girls in the middle that have an annual lemonade stand every year. And with the funds that they raise, they support both the homeless ministry and Wings of Refuge. So it's doing what they love to fight what they hate, which is trafficking. So we are always just so touched by their creativity. So before we get back, just bounce back to that informational session, I just wanted to share one of the important things in working with trafficking survivors is to celebrate the wins. It is the stories that the women carry can feel heavy and dark. And so it's really important that we sit in a posture of celebration. And so just realizing that even if the day was hard and didn't go as planned, trauma can come out in unexpected and even ugly ways. The women in our home are not being trafficked. Every day that they wake up in our home, they are waking up in freedom. A survivor connects with family. Sometimes sometimes people are actually trafficked by their family members, and so their family isn't safe. But in some cases, they've been separated by the trafficker from their family, and we help to reconcile those relationships when they're safe. And so watching them reconnect with family. We had a young woman who, when she was with us, wanted to go ahead and put effort and energy into completing her high school equivalency exam. That was not something, she didn't have the opportunity to complete high school. And so while she was with us, she started taking classes and passed her high school equivalency about the same time she was graduating from our program. So the picture there in the middle is the graduation ceremony that we had for her, including all the pomp and circumstance. She wore a cap and gown, and people from her church and community came to support that. So very exciting. I just wanted to take a moment here, and I'm going to see if can you now see human trafficking myths on my screen? Yes, I'm seeing Sarah. So I wanted to end here before we go to questions with just some of the typical myths that you see. And I'm pulling this from Polaris Project, which is a great place to go to learn more information. It's polarisproject.org, and they do a great job of, they're the ones that actually host the hotline. So I just wanted to share some of these. I'm not going to click on them all, but just some of them that typically we have incorrect information about. So I'm going to start with this one. Traffickers target victims they don't know. You've already heard me say that, but many survivors have been trafficked by romantic partners, including spouses, and by family members, including parents. That was, again, one of the heavy, dark ones I learned, is there are situations where kids, their trafficking starts in their own home from their parents for a lot of different reasons. And I think what's just important to realize when that's the case is they're hiding in plain sight. Those kids who are being trafficked, they're still going to school. They're still participating in activities in the community, all the while they're living these nightmares at home. Because I talked about a lot of women, because that's who we serve. I'll click this one. Only women and girls can be victims and survivors of sex trafficking. Of course, that isn't true. Men and boys are also victimized by sex traffickers. LGBTQ boys and young men are seen as particularly vulnerable to trafficking. Only undocumented foreign nationals get trafficked in the US. Players has worked on thousands of cases of trafficking involving foreign national survivors who are legally living and working in the US. These include both survivors of sex and labor. I'm just going to skip down here. Human trafficking involves moving or traveling or transporting a person across state or national borders. So many times we think like, oh, trafficking happens in Iowa because of interstates. And while that's true, what do interstates allow? They allow people to be transported and maybe kind of stay under the law enforcement radar. You don't have to be transported for trafficking to occur. Again, I've already shared some comments. Kids can be trafficked under their own roof, literally never leaving the, parameters of the cities or homes that they live in. Human trafficking is often confused with human smuggling, which involves illegal border crossings. In fact, the crime of human trafficking does not require any movement whatsoever. They can be recruited in their own homes, in their own towns, and even their own homes. Just a couple more here. People being trafficked are physically unable to leave their situations, locked or held against their will. So again, that's where we sometimes picture that physical bondage. That is sometimes the case. More often, however, people in trafficking situations stay for reasons that are more complicated. Some lack the basic necessities to physically get out, such as transportation or safe place to live. Some are afraid for their safety. Some have been so effectively manipulated, they do not identify at that point as being under the control of another person. So again, this is a huge myth. Even the response to law enforcement, I'll get the question a lot like, gosh, if they were out in public or if there was law enforcement around, why aren't they running toward them? Well, one is because of brainwashing, control, and coercion techniques. They are taught to fear law enforcement, not to look at them as a place of help. So sometimes what we think seems logical in our brain is not what we're seeing played out because of the techniques the traffickers are using. So you're not going to see them necessarily run toward help. Instead, you might see them avoiding law enforcement because of fear. One more. People in active trafficking situations always want help getting out. Every situation is unique, and self-identification as a trafficking victim or survivor happens along a continuum. Fear, isolation, guilt, shame, misplaced loyalty, and expert manipulation are among many factors that keep a person from seeking help or identifying as a victim, even if they are, in fact, actively being trafficked. Now, I will say that one is, again, one of the eye-opening ones for me is that if you were in a room filled with trafficking survivors and ask who in this room is being trafficked, you might not get a hand go up. Why? Because even survivors, even victims and survivors sometimes think that trafficking, like they'll say, well, I wasn't kidnapped. I'm not being physically held. And so they think that because it was who they thought was their boyfriend having them do this, that that's not trafficking. So there is this huge gap of even self-awareness of some survivors, of even realizing that what is happening to them is in fact trafficking. So I'm just going to skip that because we've covered it as we come near the close here. So these are some questions. I took this from, you can see the blue campaign in that bottom corner is where I pulled this from. And so these are some identifying questions that can be on the lookout. I'm not going to read them all, but I will read just a couple. And this is how you can help identify survivors or victims of trafficking. Is the victim in possession of their own identification and travel documents? Again, if I take your identification documents, that's a way to control you. Are they coached on what to say? So sometimes, like if they're in a hospital setting, they might, instead of being able to speak for themselves, they might have someone there with them actually speaking on their behalf. Are they free to contact friends or family without being coached or monitored? Are they living in substandard housing? So those are just some identifiers, not inclusive. And here I just share, this is a brochure. It's a trifold brochure, so it's laid out a little unique here, but this is a brochure that we have that helps women identify that they are in fact being trafficking. So kind of asking that question, have you ever been forced to use sex in ways you would never choose? I'm going to click forward here and bring your attention to the left at these questions. These are some questions that can help when they know, like if they answer yes to. So questions like, were you ever required to have sex in exchange of something of value like money or drugs? Has your boyfriend or someone you have ever known and trusted ask you to engage in sex for money to help the relationship or family? Were you ever prostituted and told you weren't capable of doing anything else? So again, this is the type of questions. It's not necessarily asking the question of, are you being trafficked? But it's going a little bit deeper and saying, is this a situation you are experiencing? Because many times they're not going to self-identify with just the being trafficked label. So I wanted to share here, these are two really important numbers that if you'd like, they're great to have in your phone as resources. So the difference here, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is the hotline that can be called by victims, but also can be called by the general public that thinks they might be seeing a situation of trafficking. So you can report a situation. So that's a great one to have in your phone. We always say, instead of the guidance that we've been given and we give, is that if you do see a situation that you think might be trafficking, instead of saying, I think I'm seeing trafficking, report factually what you're actually seeing. I saw a girl go into, like whatever you're literally seeing that made you suspect versus declaring it to be trafficking. The second one is Iowa Victim Service Call Center. So this call line is specifically for Iowa and it's for victims to call themselves. So they are networked obviously a little tighter in the state of Iowa, but either phone number would be good to call as a victim. But that first one is the one you would call to report something. And so with that, I'm just going to take a pause now and say thank you so much for the opportunity to be with the group. And I would love to open it up for questions or to take some that you might have already prepared, Sarah.
Yeah, I have a few questions, so if it's okay, I'll start there and then maybe I'll answer or propose questions that other people are thinking as well. And feel free also to put questions in the chat and we can address those as well. So as we anticipated, heavy and hard information to process, but so important for us to, again, be aware of, and so grateful to have your program here in Story County, close by Boone, where we're located, by Boone County. So I'm curious about a couple of things just in logistics of just what I'm saying. You said there were 5 mini apartments within the house. I'm assuming that there's times where you have to turn people away. What is the network like for people to be for you to be able to shift people somewhere else? I assume there's many other places like Wings of Refuge around the US. How does that network work? If you can just give us kind of a little bit of a background on that.
Yep, absolutely. So we are able to take a max of 10 women currently. We can take 5 in our restoration home and then 5 in our transitional living center. The difference there is, in order to go to the transitional living, you need to be a graduate of our program or a similar program. So it's kind of, that second step. But how women come to us is, there are referral systems. So for example, there's like a national network of shelters that if you provide shelter for survivors of sex trafficking, then many of us are a part of those national networks, and we get referrals from there. Like, hey, I'm looking for a woman that's looking for placement. Generally, that is sent to any safe home that matches the criteria of what each survivor is looking for. Like, are we the right fit? So there's usually a few homes in the US that are asking the question, do we have availability? Are they a right fit? And then you start that journey with the woman. Our program is voluntary, so we do some interviews so that they can meet us, we can meet her to determine again if we are a right fit. And so she doesn't have to choose us just because we're available. That's up to her as well. And so you ask about the network, like if we do either have to say no because we're either filled or it's just we're not what she's looking for, we are working with other homes or other resources to get her connected to a better fit. So what I mean by that is there aren't a ton of long-term safe homes specific to survivors of sex trafficking, but there are, there's more today than there was 10 years ago when we were started. But I'll just give you like a little demographic of around the Des Moines area. You have Dorothy's House in Des Moines that is same thing, long-term restoration. And then you have a little further south of Des Moines, a ministry called Garden Gate Ranch. And Garden Gate only provides housing or they target women who are pregnant or have children under the age, I think, 3 and under. We serve adult female survivors without children. It doesn't mean they don't have kids, but maybe they don't have custody of their kids or whatnot. So if we get an inquiry that's better suited to Garden Gate, then we're going to, refer her that way and vice versa. So there is this, I think when you get into trafficking, you realize it is a really complex issue. And so we are all collaborating, not competing. Like we ultimately want to find placement for every person looking for long-term placement. And so we're all working together toward that end. So yeah, great
Sure.
question.
Absolutely. Well, and also included in that too, I assume that the first step is that emergency shelter so that then they can make the decision on going into transitional housing. So is there emergency shelter available?
I love that you asked that because that is the big gap right now in Iowa and honestly across many states across the US. It's not that there are no places to go. Many of the victims are showing up at homeless shelters or maybe domestic violence shelters. There are not a lot of emergency shelters specifically for survivors of sex trafficking. And so what you end up with is people like victims that might feel uncomfortable at a co-ed homeless shelter where there's communal space, things like that. And so there is a gap of emergency care. Now we are getting ours from, if you're familiar with the resources in the area, they might be involved with Access or the Bridge Home, like the homeless shelter, but there aren't a lot of great options for for emergency shelter right now for survivors of sex trafficking. That is an area that we're kind of teasing out, like, is that next, for us or someone in the community, to fill that gap. So
Okay, good to know. And I know that you work with hospitals, so hopefully we'll be able to have a deeper conversation about that too at some point. I think the other thing too that I'm curious about, and I think maybe everybody else might wonder too, is some of our extent of our information is what we see in the back of a bathroom door. And so I'm just curious a little bit more about, you know, I know obviously that connects you to the hotline, so people can contact the hotline that way. But this level of control, probably like what you were saying there, somebody's holding their possessions. Like, what are the chances that they have their cell phone on them? And I guess that maybe that just all goes back to like the small percentage that's actually being reported. I'm just curious if you can maybe help us understand a little bit more from that perspective of what we see on the back of the door, how people are able to connect, what are kind of some of the stories maybe behind that. I'm not sure that that's the right question, but
Yeah, and you will notice if you pay attention to those signs on the back of doors, they are asking questions differently too. So, I kind of shared some of the questions we're asking on our brochure to help with that self-identification. They have changed over the last few years to start asking a little bit deeper probing questions to help them self-identify. So you are seeing that. We do get some referrals from the hotline, and what that looks like is sometimes that woman will show up at a domestic violence shelter. She'll call the hotline, like once she's kind of escaped or gotten out of her situation. And then the hotline is giving you a list of organizations in your state that is providing, services to survivors of trafficking. So we are very connected with the hotline in that way. I mean, I've taken phone calls where they have been referred from the hotline. But each woman's like escape from the life, if you will, is very unique. I mean, some, like, even if you're not being physically bound, you still have to escape out of your situation away from the trafficker, right? And so sometimes those stories are, I waited for that moment where I could sneak out, get out, whatever. Even if she wasn't being physically bound, she was, scared, looking for her moment of escape. Other times they come from, they go to the hospital because of injuries that they've sustained. And if you have a trained nurse or doctor that's actually helping her identify that she's a victim of trafficking, and then you might have someone from that hospital then calling a social service agency that's going to help her get placed with someone. And so you also have situations like in jails or prisons where they've been criminalized, like what would we call the crime of sexual exploitation or commercial sex, prostitution. But
Mhm.
when you have people that actually get to, like, how did she get into that situation and was it her choice? Then, we've had connections through law enforcement, through jails, prisons, things like that as well, when they've been criminalized instead of really being seen as the victim, which they were. So yeah, every woman's story is very different. And but yeah, that we, sometimes it is directly from the hotline that they're getting connected to us as well.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. Let me see here what other questions I had. Oh, I think the only other thing that I was curious about was I heard you talk about, and maybe I missed this, the 8,600 is the estimated number in Iowa.
Yeah.
Do you know what out of that 10,000 is that, is that like, what's our actual number in Iowa? 10,000 is national. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you a rough estimate because I don't have it wrote down, but I think it's like 286 or 287 for 1 year's time to the
Mhm.
national hotline for Iowa, where Iowa was mentioned enough times that they slotted, the victim as being, or the situation being related to Iowa. So that's where, like, when they say, yeah, 1 in 9 being reported, that's the number, but they're estimating what they think that represents, just based on what's being reported. So, yep.
Sure. And it does sound like, even though it doesn't necessarily mean they're going across state lines, I'm sure there's cases where people are moving frequently. So you're saying that's why they kind of have to pinpoint what really qualifies as an Iowa case versus if they've been in 5 states in 5 months or whatever it is. So,
Yep, exactly. Yes. I mean, sometimes that's what I'm saying. Like, everything that I said is, it's not 100% of situations,
right.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. Well, right. And obviously, I mean, 286 is 286 too many. So,
Mhm.
that's the reality of it. Even if, again, like you said earlier, it could sound like a big number, it could sound like a small number to some people. But any is too much, right? And that's
And
what
so,
you're
just to give a little more context, in 1 year's time, if you added those that called into the Iowa Victims Hotline and the national line, the number, I think the most recent numbers we had was like 634 for the state of Iowa in 1 year between the two hotlines. But
okay.
what that doesn't tell you, like, someone could have called the same situation to both hotlines, or, I mean, it's just, you can't tease out that number exactly.
Sure.
But again, we know that that's the ones that actually made the phone call, so.
Sure. And then when you and I were talking earlier before all of the recording and everything today, I was talking about one speaker I heard talking about her story, and what she's doing now is really her kind of her whole purpose. You talk about like these people actually getting their life back or starting their life. So her kind of life mission is to educate law enforcement about sex trafficking and what to look for. Is there anything more on that that you can share from the perspective of like working with law enforcement around our area? Do you have any people that have any women that have come out of your program that have risen up to that level of wanting to help with that? Is there anything around that that you can share?
Yeah, so I would say a lot of goals, and ours included, is to provide opportunities for survivor leaders in your organization if that's what they desire to do, if they desire. And so we do. We have some survivor leaders that are working for our organization. Now, sometimes you don't see their face on the website for reasons of safety and things, depending what their situation is. So we do have those happening. But you also have women that will start their own initiatives, like maybe what you're talking about, where they're wanting. And you have other women who just want to be separated from it. They don't want that to be what defines them necessarily, if that's not where they feel called. And so something that we got coached on, which I think is so helpful, is some women are anxious to tell when they feel like they're in a healthy place. They're anxious to tell their story, to share the reality. And
Mhm.
some have regretted doing that because 5 years later, 10 years later, they might not be working in the trafficking space. And now they have this video out there that is telling. And so we really are very intentional of being careful and cautious with stories that are told, because and obviously very willing to take anything down that they don't want up, but just not doing any type of re-exploitation if the women just want to move on past that part of their story. So again, every woman is very different in her desire to stay engaged with it or not. Yeah.
And that really makes sense too. And that actually brought up one more question, and hopefully, yeah, I think we have a few more minutes. So everything's so interesting, and every time you say something, it's like, oh, I have one more question. So the therapy side of them coming into the program, how does that work? Do you have a therapist on site on staff? Do you connect them with therapists? How does that work?
Yeah, we currently don't have a counselor on staff. We might move that direction someday, but instead we work through partnerships. So counselors that say that they have availability to hold spots for women coming into our program that are trauma informed and, comfortable taking complex trauma situations. And so we had been working primarily with one counselor, but we are broadening that network just because naturally the women come with different mental health issues and different challenges, and one counselor isn't necessarily the expert in all those situations. So we are working with a network of counselors or different specialties to help walk alongside the women. So yeah, that is external, but it's through partnerships, like we are in partnership with several counselors. So
Sure. Well, and then as we all know, well, most of us know, probably everybody at least listening to this knows that there is a mental health, therapy counselor shortage, and that's the other part to it too that I'm sure is a challenge that you're up against and facing as well.
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for your time and energy today, and everything that you do with this program. And definitely, I hope that you and I can reconnect to talk a little bit more about how we can serve that, from the hospital standpoint. So thank you,
Yes.
Brandy.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone else for joining today. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Take care.